treason, invasion, conquest. Those are just a few of the ways that the founders and old revolutionaries described usurpation. That's power stolen, not delegated. This was actually a fundamental, although totally forgotten, principle behind the American Revolution. So on this episode, we're going to uncover these powerful roots from people like Locke and Sidney, Paine and Adams, and many others, ideas that fueled the spirit of 1776. Because when government repeatedly goes beyond the limits of the Constitution, it's not just some innocent mistake. It's not just bad policy. It's not just politics as usual. It's actually government waging a war against the sovereignty of the people. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome. And thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, April 2nd, 2025. So how do we spot this treason at home? Let's start here with St. George Tucker in his great View of the Constitution of the United States. He wrote, If in a limited government, the public functionaries exceed the limits which the Constitution prescribes to their powers, every such act is an act of usurpation in the government, and as such, treason against the sovereignty of the people, which is thus endeavored to be subverted and transferred to the usurpers. There's a lot to unpack there, but let's start it out. Of course, Tucker called this treason, this usurpation. And Thomas Paine explained the foundation of it, where all power comes from. He said all power exercised over a nation must have some beginning. It must either be delegated or assumed. There are no other sources. All delegated power is trust, and all assumed power is usurpation. Now, so if you listen to this concept here, the notion is that the people are the source of all power. They hold sovereignty or final authority, and government exists only as their agent and servant. We'll get to that a little bit more in a moment. But when they violate the trust that they've been given, the rules that they've been given, this is a serious, serious problem. Now, Paine and Tucker and many others who cited this, they weren't inventing something new. They weren't just making things up out of thin air. These were long-established principles recognized for generations. And here, over a century earlier, we have Algernon Sidney laying pretty much the same foundation. He said, the making of laws, coronation, inauguration, and all that belongs to the choosing and making of kings or other magistrates is merely from the people, and that all power exercised over them, which is not so, is usurpation and tyranny. And John Locke, a few years later, took the same idea a step further, and he explained that usurpation is a theft of power that belongs to someone else, because, of course, if the people hold sovereignty, final authority, and they're only delegating certain things to government, and government just does whatever beyond those limits, this is a theft. This is a usurpation of power. And that's how Locke put it. He said, usurpation is the exercise of power which another hath a right to. Now, we know the old revolutionaries fought a long, bloody war to free themselves from the evils of usurpation. And that's exactly how it was described in the Declaration of Independence itself. Now, we know today almost everyone says, oh, they had a list of grievances, like a list of complaints. Now, certainly they had a list of problems, but they weren't called grievances in the document. They were called, for example, a long train of abuses and usurpations. They also wrote, the history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations. So they were telling the whole world, because everyone understood what these terms meant, at least at the time, that this wasn't just bad policy. This wasn't just a problem because of how it impacted the people. Of course, Jefferson had a similar take in 1774, where he said, we're not declaring these acts void because of the impacts of them. We're saying so because You have no right to exercise these powers over us. This was a usurpation of power and therefore null. And so this was telling the world in the Declaration of Independence they were dealing with power that was usurped, that was stolen, that they never had authority in Britain to take and exercise and use against the people in the colonies. Now, back to Tucker, the revolutionaries certainly understood that merely declaring principles, talking about them, talking about limits of government, didn't work all that awesome under the unwritten British Constitution, so they had to lock them in and put them in writing. And St. George Tucker explained this. That's exactly what the revolution produced: written constitutions. He said the American Revolution seems to have given birth to this new political phenomenon. In every state, a written constitution was framed and adopted by the people, both in their individual and sovereign capacity and character. And of course, this affirmed a core truth, another foundational principle, not only from the American Revolution, but the entire system under the Constitution as well, that the people hold sovereignty or final authority. They are the source of all power, and government is merely their agent. And Tucker continued. He said, by this means, the just distinction between the sovereignty and the government was rendered familiar to every intelligent mind. So it taught the people the difference versus the system that everyone was used to all through history. He said the former, that is, the sovereignty, was found to reside in the people and to be unalienable from them. The latter in their servants and agents. Now, future Chief Justice a few years earlier, John Jay, first Chief Justice of the United States, he described this same principle as one of the foundational principles of the Constitution. He said the Constitution only serves to point out that part of the people's business which they think proper by it to refer to the management of the persons therein designated. And of course, John Jay hammered this home, the fact that government is just an agent of the people. Nothing more, nothing less. That's it. He said, those persons are to receive that business to manage, not for themselves and as their own, but as agents and overseers for the people to whom they are constantly responsible and by whom only they are to be appointed. Now, of course, the founders didn't just see usurpation of power as a legal problem or a political problem. They saw it as something far more dangerous, and they repeatedly talked about this. And there are many people, we're going to go back in history a little further, that talked about it like this as well. It wasn't just theft of power. Stealing is bad enough. But in fact, usurpation of power was really a form of war on the people themselves. And that's how Benjamin Franklin described things in a speech in the Philadelphia Convention. He said, as all history informs us, there has been in every state and kingdom a constant kind of warfare between the governing and the governed. And at the height of the American Revolution, this is in 1775, Samuel Adams had almost the same take in a letter to Arthur Lee. He called violations of rights and liberties invasions. An invasion is an act of war. So if you're referring to this as an invasion of liberty, he's pointing out that they're waging war on the liberty of the people. He said, the people hold the invasion of their rights and liberties, the most horrid rebellion, and a neglect to defend them against any power whatsoever, the highest treason. This also wasn't new in 1775. A century earlier, back to Algernon Sidney, he called people who usurp power enemies of the people. He said, if he be justly accounted an enemy to all who injures all, he above all must be the public enemy of a nation, who by usurping a power over them does the greatest and most public injury that a people can suffer. I mean, it's hard to overstate how much impact that has. How much he's really hammering home that someone who usurps power, steals power from the people, is doing the greatest and most public injury that a people can suffer. And of course, Locke took it a little bit further. He pointed out that usurpation isn't just theft, it's a form of domestic conquest. Again, a term of war. He said, as conquest may be called a foreign usurpation, so usurpation is a kind of domestic conquest. And when people in power go beyond their limits, this is back to Locke, he said that puts them, he specifically said this puts them in a state of war with the people. He said, whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power is another one of those so-called grievances, injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence. It's James Otis Jr. basically said arbitrary power is do whatever you want, do what you will. Doesn't matter what the rules are. So when they're exercising under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people. In Cato's letter number 25, this is in the early part of the 18th century, Thomas Gordon did not hold back. Basically, there's possibly nothing worse than lawless power. That's usurpation, arbitrary power, just doing stuff that they're not authorized to do. And he also called it a state of war on the people. He said there is something so wanton and monstrous in lawless power that there scarce ever was a human spirit that could bear it. And the mind of man, which is weak and limited, ought never to be trusted with power that is boundless. The state of tyranny is a state of war. And I think from all this, the message is pretty clear. And St. George Tucker really brought it home full circle here. He said there is, I got to change the screen here. He said every delegated authority implies a trust. Responsibility follows as the shadow does its substance. But where there is no responsibility, authority is no longer a trust, but an act of usurpation. And here we go. And every act of usurpation is either an act of treason or an act of warfare. And they don't talk about government power this way today, not even close. But this was the most widely read commentary on the Constitution in the early part of the Republic. And of course, we're talking about people like Locke and Sidney and Paine and Adams and so many others. We're going to get to Vattel and Cicero and a few others in just a few minutes. But first of all, I want to mention that all these sources that I'm citing in this episode, because I'm just scratching the surface, and I'm hoping that you're going to be encouraged to read and learn more on your own time. We're going to get a blog post, by we, I mean Alan Mosley is going to get a blog post organized for this episode that has a show links section with the reference links, generally in the order that I'm going through it here in this episode, and I will get it published a couple of hours after the live stream is done. That'll be over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. But let's get right back to it. Of course, St. George Tucker's point cuts pretty deep, just like Thomas Paine before him. Very similar message a few years later. Power is a trust, not a crown to do whatever the heck they want. And you break that trust, and it's not just theft, it's treason and war. Treason against the sovereignty of the people and war on the rights and liberties of the people. Now, of course, again, this was not some new American revolutionary view, some new American twist. It was a principle that actually went back centuries. Cicero, over 2,000 years ago in Treatise on the Commonwealth, this is somewhere around 50-ish BC, he saw it like that as well, too. He wrote, "For as soon as a king assumes an unjust and despotic power," again, it's about assuming a power, "all delegated power is trust, all assumed power," Paine put it, "is usurpation." And Cicero's talking about assumed power, power that's not authorized, even for a king. "For as soon as a king assumes an unjust and despotic power, he instantly becomes a tyrant, than which there can be nothing baser, fouler. No imaginable animal can be more detestable to gods or men. For though in form a man, he surpasses the most savage monsters in infernal cruelty." Fast forward to 1758, and Vattel doubles down in the Law of Nations, where he says breaking the Constitution, violating the Constitution, is a capital crime against society. He said to attack the Constitution of the state and to violate its laws is a capital crime against society. And if those guilty of it are invested with authority, so people who have been delegated power, they add to this crime a perfidious abuse of the power with which they are entrusted. The nation, wrote Vattel, ought constantly to repress them with its utmost vigor and vigilance as the importance of the case requires. And a few years earlier, Jean-Jacques Burlamaqui, the guy that we can probably point to as the lead inspiration for the phrase pursuit of happiness, which was put in the Declaration of Independence, he pointed out that the people are not bound to obey usurpation of power. This should be pretty obvious. He said, if the abuse of the legislative power proceeds to excess and to the subversion of the fundamental principles of the laws of nature and of the duties with which it enjoins, it is certain that, under such circumstances, the subjects are, by the laws of God, not only authorized, but even obliged to refuse obedience to all laws of this kind. No obedience is due to usurpation of power. And Burlamaqui was taking another step, saying, oh, maybe you're required to refuse obedience. Otherwise, you're giving sanction to tyranny. Now, Burlamaqui was really just building on the work of other people. We can name a bunch of them that had a similar take, but here's one from Thomas Gordon, also in Cato's Letters, number 33. This is in June of 1721. He took the position that no one was bound to obey usurpations of power. He said, human reason says that there is no obedience, no regard due to those rulers who govern by no rule but their lust. Such men are no rulers. They are outlaws who, being at defiance with God and man, are protected by no law of God or of reason. And Patrick Henry in 1765, he echoed this same principle in his resolutions against the hated Stamp Act. He first of all referred to such acts, internal taxation specifically in this example, as illegal, unconstitutional, and just. And if you have an unconstitutional, illegal act, of course, the people are not bound to obey them. He said, the inhabitants of this colony are not bound to yield obedience to any law or ordinance whatever designed to impose any taxation whatsoever upon them other than the laws or ordinances of the General Assembly aforesaid. Again, that's Patrick Henry in his great resolutions against the Stamp Act in 1765. And Tucker tied this all together. First of all, reminding us that acts beyond the limits of the Constitution are not law at all. They're void. They're a nullity. He said acts of Congress to be binding must be made pursuant to the Constitution. Otherwise, they are not laws, but a mere nullity, or what is worse, acts of usurpation. And of course, usurpation is treason against the sovereignty of the people. Now, this being the case, the people are not bound to obey them. And on top of it, anyone taking an oath to support the Constitution, well, they're also bound to actively oppose all usurpations of power. And Tucker wrote, the people are not only not bound by them, but the several departments and officers of the governments, both federal and state, are bound by oath to oppose them. For being bound by oath to support the Constitution, they must violate that oath whenever they give their sanction by obedience or otherwise to any unconstitutional act of any department of the government. Tucker did not mince any words. Neither did Patrick Henry or Paine or Vattel or Burlamaqui or Sidney or Locke. Violating the Constitution is not just bad policy. Violating the rules given to government is not just a mere mistake, especially when you do it consistently. The Constitution isn't a suggestion. It's the supreme law of the land. And any act that goes beyond those limits, doesn't matter how small that act is no law at all. It's a usurpation. It's a theft of power. It's an act of treason and warfare against the supreme sovereignty of the people. And I didn't make this stuff up. I read it in the books of the people who laid the foundational principles of the American Revolution. Locke and Sidney and Cicero and Vattel and Burlamaqui and many others. Paine and Adams and Franklin. And they all said the same thing. When government crosses the line, it turns from servant, from agent, into enemy. And St. George Tucker was so clear. He called it treason against the sovereignty of the people whenever government usurps power, whenever they exercise power beyond the limits of the Constitution. And here's the kicker that almost everyone ignores in modern times. Treason and tyranny will never stop themselves. It's up to the people to protect and defend their own Constitution and their own liberty, whether the government happens to like it or not. I don't know about you, but if you're anything like me, you never learned any of this stuff in the government-run schools. They don't teach any of this stuff. And that's a big part of why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to reach and teach more and more people about this essential history from the founders, from the old revolutionaries, crucial principles going even further back to the people that they learned from. And nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat that they're quickly devaluing day in and day out, year in and year out, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Or if you don't really want to become a member, that's cool too. Or if you already are one, that's even more cool and you want to throw a little bit more support our way. I just want to make sure you have the option to make a one-time contribution over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. I won't belabor the point. I'd be extremely grateful for any support you can consider throwing our way. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members and /donate. You can also do a number of free and easy peasy things to help us spread the word, mainly by triggering algorithms of the mainstream platforms. Leave some comments, like, subscribe, get notifications, reviews on Apple Podcasts, any other podcast platform, and on platforms like YouTube. Watch time percentage helps out a ton. So hopefully I'm keeping this at least interesting and engaging, because if you watch 50% of it, that's okay. But 80% is better. 100% is way better. 180%. It's so good, you got to listen to it again or a couple of times in a row. That will tell the algorithm to show us to more and more people. And your help is really helping us reach way more people than I ever thought possible. Thank you so much. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Again, I hope it was at least interesting, a little entertaining here and there, but more important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. Again, thank you so much for being here. I've got shows coming up this week, Friday, next week, Monday and Wednesday, and then off next week, Friday. So I just want to make sure you were aware of the schedule. So I appreciate you being here, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the path to liberty.